of Columbia University, formerly the director of the Harriman Institute at Columbia. This is the latest installment after a summer break of our New York City Russia Public Policy series, which is a joint endeavor between the Harriman Institute at Columbia and the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at NYU. It is generously supported by funding by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. The purpose of this seminar is to bring together top scholars, often with practitioners, to provide discussion of contemporary issues of interest. This series has been going on now for many years, I think 5 or 6 years at this point, and we went to an all virtual format during the pandemic in order to increase the numbers of people who are able to join us. So we want to thank everyone for joining us here today. The format of what is going to happen is we have 4 excellent speakers on our topic today, which is war on Ukraine, the counteroffensive, and what's next, which is an incredibly timely topic that we wanted to start the semester with. The format works. We'll have each of our panelists, Alex will introduce each of our panelists in turn. They're going to speak for approximately 10 minutes with some prepared opening remarks, at which point we'll open it up to question and answer. You can use, given that this is a webinar format, you can use the Q&A button on the Zoom. If you're watching on YouTube, you could just put a question in the comments there. And the nice thing about that is you can actually just leave your questions while the speakers are speaking. We'll get to them after all of the speakers are done speaking, or you could wait until the Q&A period. Alex and I will then field the questions. Sometimes, depending on how many they are, we'll try to bundle them so we can get to the most number of questions that are there. And then that will be Q&A, and we will wrap up by no later than 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. So once again, thanks for joining us all here today for this important topic. These run about once a month, so keep an eye on the websites of the Harriman Institute and the Jordan Center. You can sign up for the mailing list at either place to get notification about future events. Alex?
Josh, thanks so much. It's good to be back. And we wanted to start off this academic year's offerings with an analysis of Ukraine's counteroffensive. This was a topic of a lot of discussion, analysis, news coverage, questions as to whether it was succeeding or failing, what the metrics should be, and what are the next steps? Are we on a countdown to a cessation of operations, and then what will happen after that? So to join us, we have 4 really wonderful experts, and what we'll do is we'll post their extended bios in the chat, so we won't take up too much time introducing them, and we'll go I'll introduce them as they speak. So first off is Volodymyr Dubovic, and Professor Dubovic is an associate professor and director of the Center for International Studies at the Odessa Mechnikov National University, actually joining us from Chisinau. So Volodya, you've been generous enough to participate in some of these before. Welcome back. Give us the perspective, the regional perspective from Ukraine as to the state of the counteroffensive and your perceptions of it.
Right. Thank you, Alex and Josh, and good to be with you again. Like you said, I had opportunities to present in person and also online for your series, speaking series, but also in particular settings in NYU and at Columbia as well. I must say that, of course, all glances are on offensive for good reason. But at the same time, what I don't like is there's too much hinging on it. And that was an anticipation going into it last spring, the spring of this year, when people were expecting for offensive to start. And too many people were making these assumptions that depending how it goes, we'll see what happens next. And it was a war, and with support to Ukraine and so on. And should we give more or not, depending on what happens? And many of us, Ukrainian experts and scholars, push back against this, basically saying, look, it's just going to be one offensive. We don't know what's going to happen. Hopefully it's going to be great, a total success for Ukrainian military. But what if not? Then it doesn't doesn't have to be some kind of a curtain over the stage, okay, we're doing something else. We're not giving any more support to Ukraine, maybe, or less of it. Different type of weapons. We're going to try it. That was our one try. So we fought back as much as we could against this thinking. And of course, now in 3+ months of the offensive, and that's exactly what we're facing. The music is that we're facing is that people are growing chorus of people who are saying, look, Ukrainians are not succeeding. So we need to think about something else. So track B, diplomacy track, alternative solution. Disregarding often the situation on the ground. Like, is Ukraine ready? Probably not. Is Russia ready? Given any signs that they're ready? No. So there's no space really there in between those two countries in terms of us being ready to talk about anything else but still military solution. Both sides still continue to think that they have something, they have a goal, they have something they can achieve militarily. Ukraine is still pushing, slowly, incrementally gaining some ground. Russia is having this heavy defensive lines and maybe producing more of their own weapons and, getting weapons from countries like Iran or North Korea, maybe now. So they have the money to fund the war basically indefinitely. The sanctions are not working in a way that we hoped for. So, both Putin and Zelensky have their way of thinking that maybe we should continue with the military operation. And of course, the political situation for Zelensky is a kind of a trap. Even if he sees that offensive is not working, maybe he couldn't say that openly, to discourage Ukrainians. And, the moment we need to understand, the moment that when Zelensky says, okay, maybe we need to sit down with Russians and discuss something and maybe give them away temporarily some of our lands, let them control some of our occupied Ukrainian lands, there's going to be a very perilous moment for Ukraine as a nation, as a society, for Zelensky as a political leader. So he's very much limited, and of course, as we know, Ukrainian society is not Russian society. You have various voices, you have opposition, you have parliament, you have public, you have media, which is often criticizing Zelensky. So he's aware of that. So it's kind of a trap to him, and the only way forward seems that for Ukraine is to continue with offensive. This one, the next one or something, because the thinking goes, and I subscribe to that point of view, if we kind of give in into this premature ceasefire, the half-baked ceasefire, then we invite Russians to do more, maybe have operational pause and grab more weapons and continue to push in deeper into Ukraine, because the rhetorics, if you look at the rhetorics of Kremlin, didn't change much. It's still annihilation of the Ukrainian state. Ukraine as a state is some kind of aberration and so on. So we're going to do away with it. We're going to grab most of it, and then maybe other countries in Eastern Europe will have their own lots of land in Ukraine. So this kind of BS rhetorics, and we don't know, is it really a signaling only, a messaging, or is it the way the thinking goes? If you read the so-called Karaganov and others report, is it serious? Is it not? Why it was leaked? Who is it was for? But if there is any seriousness in it, it's crazy. So, they're not giving up on destroying Ukraine as a country. So it's not about NATO expansion. It's not about many other things. It's really about the future of Ukraine, So therefore, it's a trap for us. We go forward with offensive. But with offensive, we need to understand that Ukrainians are very bitter about not being provided enough. That's a growing sentiment in Ukrainian society, dominating one right now these days. So if you put on a balance scale, on the one hand, how grateful we are to countries that supported us financially with weapons and so on, hosting refugees and other things. And on another scale, why all these delays with providing weapons and all the discussions and all these red lines that are shifting very slowly all the time, but too slowly for our taste. So a lot of Ukrainians are asking this question now. If we were to have these weapons that we have now, a year ago, that our offensive there in the fall of 22, would be quite different. Russians' defensive lines were not ready. So we would have pushed much more effectively, like we did in Kharkiv region. That would be basically a continuation of Kharkiv region, but we didn't have them. So the sense of urgency and alarm only prevailed in Western capitals, starting from Washington, it seems, early this year, when people started talking about Patriot missiles and then tanks and other things. But then there's huge delays, even with the weapons that have been promised, not to mention that we want them weapons and they're not given to us. Now, of course, there is a talk about F-16. There is even talk about long-range missiles attacks and so on. So, but in Ukraine, people are thinking like, what is West doing? What is the Biden administration really doing? It's a lot of grievance these days. Do they really want us to win? Like how would the win look like? What's the strategy? We stand with Ukraine, they say, as long as it takes, but to do what exactly? Is it okay to use Ukraine? The people are now into this conspiracy theories, like US is indeed waging a proxy war and trying to just drain Russia and exhaust Russia by sacrificing Ukrainians. That's what a lot of Ukrainians now think, because, okay, why don't they give enough weapons for us to liberate this lands quicker and have a resolute victory? So there have been discussions, and people hear, of course, what Trump and his corner of GOP is saying. That's already also very much unfortunate, and people are worried. Obviously, they were worried last year with the midterm elections, but the MAGA triumph didn't happen in the House. They got some people, but not large enough caucus. But with upcoming elections next year, of course, people worried. Like, what's going to happen? Like, will we be thrown under the bus? And even with this administration, the current administration, people are also worried. Like, is this Afghanistan syndrome something with the Biden people? You at some point of time, you just say, okay, we've done enough. We couldn't do more. The public turning against it. So, okay, let's cut Ukraine loose. So even now, I personally don't see it this way. As an expert on U.S.-Ukraine relations, I don't think this administration will do it. I think they're very much invested, too much invested in this Ukraine's war. And it's very important for them, also in terms of going into elections next year. But I'm trying these days, when I talk to audiences out of Ukraine, to convey that message that the Ukrainian public and political elites as well are very much split. So in many ways, it's like one hand is giving us some weapons and supply, another is stabbing us in the back, not giving enough, not giving it quickly enough. So if we are stopped because of that, short of liberating all our lands, there will be this continuous grievance over years. So I'm as a historian, and I'm teaching a course in history of U.S. foreign policy. I'm comparing it to the Portsmouth Peace Treaty, when U.S. was kind of on Japan's side, but then intervened decisively and kind of stolen the bigger victory away from Japan by kind of forcing them to sign the Portsmouth Peace Treaty. And of course, President Teddy Roosevelt got the Nobel Peace Prize for that. But Japan got very much aggrieved by that, as we know. And slowly and surely it got to Pearl Harbor in 1941. I sincerely hope that this is not going to be the case in U.S.-Ukraine relations, but because we're going to depend, no matter what happens with this war, at this stage of this war, we're going to depend on the U.S. enormously in terms of reconstructing our economy, in terms of our future security guarantees or something like that. And therefore, of course, we should be very careful, how we tread about this. But I would conclude by saying that, for Ukrainians, there is a sobering up moment here now with this offensive. People still believe we should do it. People still believe we should try and liberate more land. There is a high trust in Ukrainian, faith with Ukrainian military. But at the same time, people need to understand now that we're losing so many of our people. So what's the cost? And therefore, even in Ukraine, people might subscribe to a point of view similar to what our colleagues like Sam Cherep or Anatol Levin are, expressing in the last few weeks. Like, okay, if Ukraine is continuing to lose their best guys, their economy is under Russian strikes, and they are not capable to liberate any more land, like, is it sustainable going forward for Ukraine? And I think in Ukraine, there is also this appearing here and there, this line of thought, this islands of thought, but still there is no space in the society for us to talk like, okay, are we going to suspend this offensive if it's not working, or what? Or we're just going to push no matter what? So this is very delicate, painful question, I should say. We have been under this resilient Ukraine situation for a year and a half, but now we are kind of questioning, there is a question mark. Is there an end to this resilience? Like, can we sustain it? How much pain Ukraine can actually take. So I have to be realistic. I mean, once again, if you ask Ukrainians, sociological polls tell you, Ukrainians say, of course, we should push and liberate all our land. But on the ground, there might be changes, but just probably not anytime soon. Yeah.
Volodya, thanks so much for that very broad and also very candid assessment of what really is a sensitive and important topic. Next, I want to move to Professor Alexandra Chinchilla, who's an assistant professor at the International Affairs at Texas A&M's Bush School of Government and Public Service, and the author of a really wonderful piece in Lawfare about the impact of U.S. security advisors on the war, and in general, part of a broader research portfolio on security assistant and military advisors and the influence of these security cooperation tools. Alexandra, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Alex and Josh, for having me. I'm really excited to be here and happy to talk about the important role of Western support in preparing Ukraine for the counteroffensive and what that might look like in the future. So I think, as you all know, who have been following the conflict, there have been recent questions that critics have raised about the degree to which Western support, particularly the training and advising piece, was effective in preparing Ukraine for the counteroffensive. And you have a couple of pieces in the media that highlight unnamed Western officials that are talking about questions about whether it's Ukraine not following Western advice, or whether Ukraine has anything to learn from Western advice. So this is an ongoing debate, and I'm hoping to shed a little bit of light on that. So some of the facts that we can see on the ground, and I'm sure Stephen and Michael will get into this later, but you see that there were some early losses with important Ukrainian brigades that were involved in the offensive, like the 47th Mechanized Brigade and 33rd Mechanized Brigade. So these videos of Western equipment losses were circulating early. You see that I think most people have agreed that Ukraine has shifted from the sort of combined arms maneuver, which basically involves synchronizing infantry and air power and artillery together in the way that NATO countries might fight, to something that looks more like attritional warfare. I'll get into that more later, and I'm sure Stephen and Mike will talk about this as well. And so really the question is, does this mean that Western support and the training advising piece has failed? And I'm going to say no. I think it's been a qualified success. I'll talk about why that's the case. But there also is room for improvement, and I'll highlight a few areas there. And then finally, I'll close with some prospects for what future U.S. support should look like, and what leading up to what I think should be the main strategic endgame of the war, which is Ukraine integrated into Western institutions like the EU and NATO, which is what we really need to keep our eye on, even as we're stuck in the day-to-day of a particular military operation that's underway now. So first, Western training and advising has been a qualified success. And so there's some important good things that Western training and advising has done. So I think where it was really important is that if you look at what has happened over the last few months, is that Ukraine dramatically expanded the size of its military. So the military that was trained and advised with Western support prior to 2022, there was a lot of turnover due to attrition and losses in the first year of the war. And so essentially there was new military capability that needed to be built to maintain the force quality of the Ukrainian military, to make sure that they were capable of launching a counteroffensive. So in order to do that, I think where Western support was really important was some of the basic training that was provided largely in the UK, but also training in Germany and in Poland. And what this was designed to do was to take mobilized soldiers with relatively limited military experience and get them up to speed. And this provides an important training demand that Ukraine could not completely fill on their own. So just in that alone, I think Western training was really important, and we shouldn't lose sight of that important fact. And what is important to see about this too is really the degree to which European states pull together to provide this kind of training. There are a lot of different providers, which provided some of its own problems, just because of trying to coordinate support among different providers can be difficult, but really represents, I think, important political will to prepare Ukraine's military for this counteroffensive, and speaks to the strong support that remains within Europe and the United States for Ukraine. So these led to preparing 17 combat brigades, which is 63,000 soldiers. And to just kind of put this in perspective of how massive this effort was, taking place over essentially a 6-month period, this is basically double the amount that was trained in 8 years by the West from 2014 to 2022. So a lot was done in a very short period of time. So another important role of training was teaching Ukrainians how to use the new equipment that they were getting from the West. And this is a hodgepodge of different things, big due to the fact that it was not just the United States providing aid, but important aid coming from European allies as well. So all of these systems were things that soldiers actually needed to be trained on, and they were able to do this relatively quickly. There are impressive reports about how training timelines were pushed up. And we also have other effects, like the survivability of Ukrainian forces is improved as a result of getting Western training and being able to have Western equipment, which again, training was required to help them in order to use it. And then, of course, very important support in terms of weapons and equipment, things like cluster munitions that were provided earlier this summer. And so kind of the second subpoint I want to make here is that this was a really tough ask to expect Western training to succeed in this very short period of time. And I think a lot of people, as we've already been talking about, had unrealistic expectations for what this counteroffensive could really accomplish. So the main critique that people have had, as I mentioned, is really limited Ukrainian ability to do combined arms operations, but it's a lot to ask new brigades to be able to do this. So the United States Army prepares for a complete annual training cycle just to get to tactical proficiency for new brigades. And that's not even asking them to do essentially what Ukraine was asked to do, which is the hardest task that you can do with an infantry brigade. So it really is a lot. And as we've already talked about, there were delays in training from moving from September all the way till January, when the operational need was developed, to pushing it back to January when it actually started. And again, you had starting with people with relatively limited military experience. So I think that some of these debates out here about whether the limited ability of Ukraine to do combined arms operations, whether that indicates lack of effectiveness in Western training, I think it's more that this is a realistic response to what is possible given the limited time to do this and the significant risks in essentially asking Ukraine to fight in the sort of way that a NATO country would fight without the full set of things that they have, which is extensive training, full combat enablers, being able to have air power. And so asking relatively recently formed Ukrainian brigades to do this, given a battlefield where there are extensive defenses, it's transparent, which essentially means that it's very easy with new technology to be able to see movement on the battlefield. So it's really a lot to ask. And so I think in this extent, switching to a strategy of attrition like Ukraine is doing makes more sense. So as we'll talk more about, attrition does not mean the same thing as stalemate. In fact, we can expect to potentially see it pay off, but that's an open question. So I think we really need to be cognizant of the fact that Western training has succeeded in this important way to prepare new brigades to be able to fight together. We did not see perhaps what some Western observers had, which is this hope of Ukraine being able to do combined arms operations in the way that NATO countries would be able to do it. But I think that's a more realistic reflection of what we could reasonably expect Ukraine to accomplish with the resources it had available, as well as with the particular fight that they're facing. And another really important thing to highlight is just that we're not there. We don't have observers on the ground. We don't have advisors on the ground. We don't even have we don't have training within Ukraine like we had prior to 2022. So this really limits what that kind of engagement can look like. Okay, so now into some shortcomings to be fixed. So delays, we've talked about this as well. There's been an extensive delay in terms of when equipment and weapons actually show up. Delays in terms of when collective training was actually approved and implemented. And as others have written about, there's been important limitations in terms of what the Western training actually looked like, that it was more in line with existing NATO programs of instruction that perhaps do not fully reflect what the battlefield looks like in Ukraine in terms of terrain, in terms of Ukrainians actually being able to train how they fight and not how NATO allies would fight. And there's also been complaints about training not being matched fully to operational needs. And I think that this is something that really is affected by the fact that the training occurs outside of Ukraine. And there's often a sort of lag about when these programs of instruction seem to be developed and then what the battlefield is going to look like or what operational plans are going to look like 6 months down the line. So I think that's some of what we see. Overall, I think that there's been too much negativity perhaps about the degree of Western training. Like, as I already mentioned, I think it's been effective in some important ways that just because everything is not unfolding exactly like our highest expectations, it does not mean that did not have an important role to prepare, given the limitations on where the training could be done and what it could look like. So now to the final point, the need to plan for a future with Ukraine and NATO. I think a lot of what we have been talking about with this counteroffensive is focused on the next few months and what this particular operation is going to look like. And I think that there is an important need to plan for it being a long war. And so I really see three key important parts to planning. So one is to maintain force quality. So this is to continue with these existing training efforts, ideally to fix them to better reflect local priorities. We also should continue with the funding and weapons, and finally begin to think about a pathway to membership for Ukraine in the EU and NATO. So this is where we actually see an important role, I think, for Western coaching and advising. And to do this, we really need to have a more consistent presence on the ground and senior leader engagement. And this means working with the strategic defense reforms that are ongoing, figuring out what Ukraine realistically needs to accomplish in order to be able to be best prepared to join NATO as part of a strategic end to this war. Thank you very much. And turn it back over to you, Alex.
Thanks so much, Alexandra. And next, we will go stay within Columbia and go to Professor Stephen Biddle, who is Professor of International Public Affairs here at Columbia and a member of the Arnold Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, also adjunct senior fellow for defense policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, with extensive academic and policy experience, and the author in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, September-October issue, Back in the Trenches, Why New Technology Hasn't Revolutionized Warfare in Ukraine. Steve, thanks so much for joining us. We're looking forward to your comments.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Alex. What I thought I would do is start by presenting some of the general principles of how one ought to go about waging war in a theater the size of Ukraine if you're trying to retake tens of thousands of square miles of defensively held ground. Say a little bit about the degree to which the two sides are reflecting those principles in the way they're fighting, though I suspect Mike Kaufman will have a lot more to say on the details of that in a minute. And then, given that kind of mapping of general principles into the behavior we're observing, what can we expect going forward? So one way you could, in principle, go about retaking tens of thousands of square miles of enemy-held territory in a theater like this is attrition. Mass artillery, press forward with close combat using infantry and armor, and simply try and kill more of them than they're going to kill of you and wear them down to the point where eventually they become numerically unable to hold the ground in question, or they suffer so many casualties that they give in, or they become willing to accept some kind of compromise settlement of the war. And the problem with this is this kind of attrition tends to be largely symmetrical, and therefore it tends to be disadvantageous for the materially inferior side. If both sides are being worn down, the bigger side is left with something when the smaller side isn't. That's not good if you're the smaller side. It also tends to be disadvantageous for the side that wants to take ground. Defenders are classically able to dig into the terrain to provide cover and concealment that is harder for attackers to secure for themselves if we're simply employing artillery to try and kill as many of the enemy as possible, and the enemy is more resistant because of the nature of the fighting positions they're occupying at the time. That will tend to give them an attritional advantage over you. As a general rule, straight up, unadulterated, win the war through attrition tends to be a tough program for a side that isn't materially superior and has to be the one that's going to take ground at this point in the war. Most theater combatants, most of the time, given this, try not to do that. Instead, classically, what a theater attacker will try to do is focus on a subset of the front, concentrate a disproportionate fraction of your resources in the theater against this subset, and then use a combination of what's referred to in the trade as combined arms fire and movement methods. We can talk more about what those are and all that if people want, to enable this differentially concentrated local advantage at the point of attack to punch a hole not annihilate the entirety of the theater defense piecemeal, but punch a hole, exploit with reserves through that hole, and use this exploitation either to envelop and surround significant parts of the defense that was not punched through and undermine its viability by cutting it off from supply and command, or simply tear up infrastructure in the enemy rear area that's used for command or resupply or air defense or other essential functions. And the point of that is to enable you to take down much of the theater defense while only fighting through a part of it, and render the rest of it or large parts of it non-viable by denying them the infrastructure, the resupply, the command, the air defense, and whatever that they need in order to be viable. And that's how you accomplish theater level success without simply grinding attrition everybody down in ways that tend to be parallel. And this is essentially what produced the German conquest of France in 1940, in which they certainly didn't kill every last French soldier one by one. They broke through and collapsed the theater defense. This is largely what undermined the German position in Northwest Europe in 1944 after the American breakthrough in Operation Cobra. This is what undermined the Egyptian defense of the Sinai in 1967. This is what undermined the Iraqi defense of Kuwait in 1991 or Iraq in 2003. Knowing that attackers are going to try to do this if they can, right? The attackers will generally prefer this style of warfare, which is not uniquely American, right? But preferable in many ways. Most defenders put a lot of effort into not letting it happen. And classically, the way you don't let it happen is, of course, you prepare your fighting positions, you take advantage of the tactical advantages of the defense to provide cover and concealment, you entrench your forces, you provide bunkers and dugouts, you dispose mines in front of your positions, you deploy obstacles and tank traps and other barriers. And then you extend that prepared defensive zone into depth into your rear area. And you withhold a sizable fraction of the total defensive force in the theater in mobile reserves behind the prepared forward positions. And the idea in this architecture is that the prepared forward positions are not going to stop the invader in their boots, right? They're not going to prevent any advance at all. What they're designed to do is slow the advance, canalize it so the defender knows where it is, inflict attrition and casualties, and buy time. And what you're doing is you're buying time for these mobile reserves behind the prepared defenses to move to the threatened area once they know where it is, and cancel the invader's ability to create a local numerical preponderance by disproportionately concentrating their forces there, by disproportionately concentrating the defenses right in front of it, or potentially counterattacking against its flanks or other ways of going about this. When both sides are doing this well, it's very hard for even skilled attackers to break through cleanly. There are very few, if any, historical examples of a well-handled, deep, elastic defense of this kind being ruptured by breakthrough and taken down at the theater level. It's a pretty effective way of fighting. It's really hard to pull off. Moreover, the offensive methods I described a moment ago are very hard to pull off. They're extremely demanding of very complex military methods that are especially hard to do in the current phrase at scale, right? To create multiple brigades that are capable of doing combined arms, fire and movement in a concentrated attack sector, and move the offensive forward fast enough to break through before the defender can counter-concept. This is an extremely difficult agenda. The defensive agenda of delaying an attacker while a mobile reserve counter-concentrates and then use it to bring the attacker to a halt in the depth of defense is also very difficult to do. In actual practice, historically, the result has been lots of variation in how well any given actor has been able to implement this agenda, either on the offense where it's especially hard, or on the defense where it's hard too. And the result of that has been variance in outcomes, where when clean breakthroughs happen, 1940, 1944, 1967, 1991, and so on, it's classically been because a well-handled attack is striking a not very well-handled defense that's making a variety of mistakes. Classically, they're too shallow and they don't have enough reserves. When both sides are implementing this approach fully, the result has tended to be slow, grinding, expensive partial advances that don't successfully break through, even when the attacker is skilled. Now, if that's the kind of general menu, if that's the cookbook for how lots of actors in the international system have understood you need to go about waging a theater war, what do we see going on in Ukraine? And again, Mike, I'm sure we'll have more details to offer, but let me offer some broad brush comments as a way of motivating some thoughts about the way forward. Neither side are doing this in the textbook approach. Not the Ukrainians, not the Russians. And this is understandable because it's, especially on the Ukrainian side, because this is so difficult and because the Ukrainians, as Alexandra has pointed out, have had so little training time to learn how to do it. Right? An American brigade would be considered competent for this if it's being developed from scratch after several years of intensive training. The Ukrainians haven't had anything like that for the new brigades they're forming. It has been widely reported, and I suspect Mike will have more to tell us in a minute, that the Ukrainians are having a great deal of difficulty doing combined arms and fire and movement at scale. They can do it with small units in particular places, but that's not enough to break through a defense of this kind. Moreover, the Ukrainians have tended to split their effort in multiple parts of the theater, which dilutes the potential advantage of differential concentration to create a numerical advantage at a chosen point. Again, this is an extremely difficult agenda. And even if you ask the US Army to do it, if the defense is well handled, the US Army isn't probably going to break through in a clean, quick rupture either, because the difficulty of the undertaking is so great. But it's especially demanding for fresh brigades that are being created from scratch. And the Ukrainians have not been doing this, and as a result have defaulted to more attritional methods. The Russians apparently are not implementing the full agenda either. The architecture of what they appear to be trying to do looks very orthodox and canonical. The Surovikin line, as it's called, looks very much like it's taken out of a standard textbook on how you dispose of theater defense. Their behavior within these positions, on the other hand, appears at least at thousands of miles distance here in lovely Morningside Heights, New York, to be not consistent with the canon, pardon the pun, in a couple of important respects. One is they appear to be concentrating their forces within the defended zone way too far forward. I mean, ordinarily, the depth of the defense is divided broadly into, all Gaul is divided into three parts. A deep defense is often divided into a covering force zone, a main battle area, and a rear area. The main battle area is where the decisive fight is supposed to be, not the forward covering zone. It's too close to the attacker. It's too easy for the attacker to inflict attrition on it with artillery. Classically, that's considered relatively expendable. The majority of the forces are disposed in the main battle area in between. The Russians appear to be pancaked against the initial line of contact and are probably therefore suffering heavier losses than they need to. Secondly, they appear to have taken—
Steve, if I can just ask you to get through your points in a couple of minutes.
The second area is they're not holding a mobile reserve of the way you would expect. Too much of it is being used offensively in the Northeast. So there may be opportunities. If there are opportunities, and if the Ukrainians are able to change their force employment in a way that can exploit them rather than just inflicting aggregate attrition, they might break through. If they do, to do what the cookbook says you got to do, you have to exploit. And it's not clear they have the ability to sustain offensive movement over the distances required to fully exploit a pole, even if they can punch it. As a result, it's plausible to expect that if the Russians are making the mistakes that they appear to be making, perhaps the Ukrainians will advance through the entirety of the Surovikin line. Whether they can exploit beyond that is another matter entirely and is also very difficult, and I'll stop there.
Great, thanks so much. And finally, we go to Michael Kaufman, and Michael needs no introduction to many of us. He is the research program director in Russian Studies program at CNA, also fellow at the Kennan Institute, Woodrow Wilson International Center in Washington. He has offered regular commentary, analysis, writing on the conflict, including a really excellent detailed piece in War on the Rocks on the state of the counteroffensive. So Michael, we'll hand it over to you. There's a lot of ground that's been covered, but certainly we're all interested in your insights and where you see things now and where you see things going.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Actually, just a note, I very recently transitioned to be a senior fellow at Carnegie. But let me talk a bit about the offensive. So a lot has already been covered by Steve's comments, Alexander's, and others. I'll try to maybe fill in some gaps where I can. So the offensive is generally thought of as three main axes of advance, the main effort being from Arihiv heading towards Tokmak and Melitopol, supporting access from Velika Novosilka, also pushing south towards the coast, and then a supporting offensive around Bakhmut, which seems principally designed to pin Russian forces there along the flanks, and it's become a pretty costly fight for the Russian military to maintain their position. Alongside that, there have been a number of Ukrainian long-range missile strikes and drone attacks targeting supporting Russian infrastructure, high-value targets in Russia itself, including a pretty successful Storm Shadow strike last night against dry docks in Sevastopol. So the offensive officially began in early June. It was an initial breaching operation, an assault that wasn't as successful as hoped. Some of the reasons for that have been covered. I've covered them extensively in a publication with my colleague Rob Lee on War on the Rocks. For those who are interested, I encourage you to take a look. I'm not going to reprise it because it's a fairly lengthy article. The Ukrainian military then switched to more of an attritional approach, emphasizing small unit tactics that played a lot to Ukrainian military strengths, and infantry advances that were largely being done at sort of the platoon and a half size level, and a focus on attaining an advantage in fires. And Ukraine had a significant qualitative advantage in fires, and probably for the first time in this war had a slight quantitative advantage in tube artillery fires over the Russian military as well. The offensive really became a battle of tree lines, advancing one tree line and one field at a time, clearing Russian defenses one position at a time. And a lot of the issues early on really came from a lack of enablers and supporting capabilities, things like mine clearing, breaching equipment, air defense, and what have you. And keep in mind, a lot of the equipment that was provided more for a mechanized assault rather than an infantry small unit advance. So very quickly, the Ukrainian forces found themselves having to adapt and fight in a way, but they weren't necessarily equipped in the best way for that type of advance. So Ukraine steadily gained an advantage in supporting artillery fire over time, and drones have inflicted a fair amount of damage as well. You've seen FPVs really take the lead role and have saturated this battlefield. I myself travel to the region, for those who don't know, go there every couple of months for field work with colleagues, and I was in Arihiv and was in the south around middle of July. And it made it very difficult to move around the battlefield with vehicles, so much of the resupply has to be done at night, troop rotations have to be done at night, and a lot of the advance has been on foot, which is why it's been sort of steady, methodical, but also perceived by people as slow. As an attritional approach isn't, as we know, doesn't make for great headlines. And that led to fitful progress over the course of the summer while Russian forces were being steadily degraded. But in recent weeks, you've seen that the Ukrainian military has managed to break through the first Russian line of defense, capturing Robotyne, and expanding that line to the outskirts of Verbova as well, and they're steadily widening the salient. They've also breached the second line of defense with infantry, and are steadily trying to expand that breach to eventually try to turn into a breakthrough. By breakthrough, meaning the ability to move mechanized traffic to it, to support with logistics and what have you, actually expand it and funnel through it. So let's talk about the Russian defense, which Steve covered somewhat. So the Russian military had a very long time to entrench. They entrenched at the level of the combined arms army in this area with layered minefields, three main defensive line, which is a fairly classical doctrinal defense, communication trenches in between them, lots of networks of bunkers, covered trenches, tunnels. A lot of things they did were not doctrinal in the Russian military. The minefields are much denser. They're a lot wider, and many other innovations and adaptations are covered in that article. I won't kind of belabor that point given our time limitations. But their units were also backed by combat aviation, combat helicopters, fixed wing aviation, artillery, and so it presented a pretty significant challenge. That said, the Russian military really concentrated on on the first line, the forward line, and they chose to fight forward, pursuing more of an active defense concept and frequently counterattacking. And that's doctrinal as well, basically pursuing more of a maneuver defense and persistently counterattacking. That stalled the Ukrainian momentum over the first 3 months, but it proved very costly to the Russian forces. It cost them a lot in armored fighting vehicles and personnel to fight this way. And rather than pursuing more traditional defense in depth approach where you trade terrain for attrition and your opponent has to constantly move up, right? So you have the advantage. They actually allowed themselves to be attrited, significantly deployed forward. And I suspect that part of the reason that took place was a bit doctrinal preference, but the biggest reason is a lack of forces available. They didn't actually have the forces to man 3 lines, and being concerned that Ukrainian military might break through the first line, develop substantial momentum, then put the Russian military into a position where they'd have to redeploy reserves, have to retreat to their own lines, right, and have to coordinate a deployment of a mobile reserve. They decided to focus on defending forward and just stalling the advance as much as they could. But nonetheless, it shows the maneuver warfare, however you look at it, at least this has been my writing with colleagues over the past year, is exceedingly difficult against a well-prepared defense. Unless you substantially worn it down with attrition, you have a real decisive advantage in fires, you can bring those effects, and in initial assault, you can attain some significant level of shock. It is very difficult, and it's not just a question of kind of how Ukrainian military is performing. It is difficult to see a Western military that would have had an easy time of it. And yes, air power is a factor, but I just want to be upfront. Air power is not talismanic. Air power enthusiasts hate it when I say things like this. It is not the be-all solution for every problem in the battlefield. Just having air power alone does not confer air superiority, does not allow you to easily break through minefields or deal with defense of this nature. So I don't like the hand waving that you hear in some Western circles of, we have air power, and with air power would have easily managed this kind of advance. And there's also coming from a lot of militaries that actually do not have sufficient I would say contemporary experience against a prepared defense of this kind and structure in this way. All right, last subpoint. So where are we now? Right, which I think is an important question. At this stage, Ukraine has deployed reserve units in the fight, but it still appears to have, I think, effective combat power to keep pushing and artillery ammunition. Ukrainian progress is such that it's forced the Russian military to deploy their strategic reserves. They've had to pull airborne divisions from the northeast and several other units as well. And they're now increasingly strained due to pressure on other fronts. So you see the pressure on the Russian military across a pretty broad front, running all the way from Bakhmut south to regions of Donetsk and Zaporizhia. I think the offensive is very much coming down to the balance of attrition at this point. Who has more reserves? Who has the combat strength to keep going? And much is going to be decided actually in the coming weeks. I know that every period in a major military operation is technically decisive. So I hate like the sophistry of decisiveness, but this current one really is. Like if you're looking for a decisive period in this offensive beyond the initial breaching attempt, right, and what happened in June, we're probably getting there. And important to recognize that these things don't progress in a linear fashion, right? So you shouldn't necessarily extrapolate from how things have been going. As Steve suggested, right now it can be a make or break moment depending on what happens with Russian reserves, their ability to maintain their position and man their lines. The most important defensive line is the line that's manned at the end of the day. And last point here, the main question right now is not whether Ukraine can really break through the Russian lines, which media tends to focus on, but that's a lagging indicator of what's happening on the battlefield. The real question is, can the Ukrainian forces break through them with sufficient strength remaining to actually exploit it to get to their objectives, which is very much what Steve said, and I think we're clearly in a line of that, right? Right, the breaking of Russian lines and attritioning of Russian forces, that is a means to an end. That's the way by which the offensive is trying to progress, but there are clear objectives behind this offensive. And lastly, the primary factors to me will be combat strength and remaining artillery ammunition. I don't think it's weather. That's come up a lot for some reason, but weather can eventually become an issue too as we get into November, but I see that as very much a secondary or tertiary factor.
Great. Michael, thanks so much for that. And sort of that part of the analysis. Let me just also invite audience members. We already have a few questions to use the Q&A function as we move into the chat. Josh?
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks to everybody for such interesting presentations, and really impressed with the way that they kind of fit together with each other to paint lots of different pictures of what's going on. One thing, so again, I want to echo what Alex said. This is a chance for people to put Q&A in the questions. We have a bunch of them we'll be going to you shortly. I want to start with the first question myself, which is trying to tie all four of these talks together. What I'm wondering is, on the one hand, we started off hearing Volodya echoing things that we all see in the press all the time, especially if you're covering domestic politics and in the U.S. as one of the questions in the Q&A talked about in terms of this is in Germany too as well, where there's this underlying narrative of the war is not going particularly well. But yet when we listen to the presentations from the rest of the panelists, from Alexander, Stephen, and from Michael, we get a picture of things that are going well, like an almost Herculean effort to get all these troops trained and to get these many troops into it. We have an understanding of how difficult the tasks are here, but also, especially in Michael's talk at the end, a lot of examples of things that seem to be going well for Ukraine, mistakes that the Russians have made. And so my question is it possible to be fighting simultaneously the right war militarily and have it not be the right war politically? And is this an inevitability? Perhaps one thing we haven't talked about was the breakthrough that occurred last fall with Kharkiv, right, around Kharkiv and this, huge taking of territory. Were we inevitably set up for this going to happen because, Stephen, is the way you talked about how difficult it is to sort of pull off these kinds of military operations, that the kind of war that was going to be fought this summer was not going to be the same kind of war that was fought in the fall and was inevitably going to disappoint in this regard? And if so, flipping back over, is there something that can happen here that changes the political, this being where Volodya started with all these concerns, where this suddenly, if there is a breakthrough, do we think that the politics of this the optics of this change dramatically? And so is there a kind of inherent tension here? That's, I guess, the question that I wanted to throw out for anybody who wants to ask. Is the right war militarily perhaps not the right outcome politically in terms of this question of maintaining continued support from the West for the efforts here? Or is that even being overblown? Do the people who are in the know in terms of providing support in the West know that this is what's happening and that this is, just sort of fodder for media coverage? Stephen, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in since no one else has taken the bait yet. Clearly, the politics of Western support for Ukraine would be easier if Ukraine could pull off another Kharkiv counteroffensive. The problem is you can't create that by fiat. The Kharkiv counteroffensive worked the way it did in part because the Russians made serious mistakes in their dispositions, aided and abetted by a limited force structure that forced them to make choices. But the choices they made, to my view, represented overinvestment in Kherson and under preparation in Kharkiv, and that made the offensive possible. If the defender doesn't make mistakes that you can exploit, it's just very difficult to just conjure at your own preference a breakthrough, because deep defenses that are backed by reserves and well prepared are just very hard for anybody to punch through in that way. Now, in a sense, you could argue that Kharkiv set people up for disappointment later, because if the Russians drew appropriate lessons from Kharkiv, which at least Surovikin clearly did, and take away that kind of mistake that creates these opportunities, then you can't just recreate it. And giving them Abrams tanks and Leopard 2 tanks and HIMARS or F-16s and ATACMS for that matter doesn't recreate that opportunity. I mean, in all likelihood, given that the Russians are not the world's most innovative military by several orders of magnitude, right? But neither are they static. They do make some effort to learn from their experience, and they do make some effort to fix gross mistakes when they've made them, are providing a harder nut to crack. So yeah, I think in some ways, the way the public debate has gone, which way over focuses on material and equipment, right? And sets up the Ukrainians for this political problem where people say, the Ukrainians have got Western tanks now. Oh my gosh, the Leopard 2 will drive to Moscow and no one will scratch it, right? I mean, material just doesn't have that kind of influence over outcomes. Behavior is way too important for that. And Russian behavior has responded to some of the gross errors that they made earlier to create a tougher nut to crack. And I think that's setting up a situation in which you can't reasonably expect Ukraine to just punch through, cut the land bridge, retake Crimea. This is going to be a much harder slog than that. And I don't know that the political system has kept up with that reality very well.
Michael, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I'll briefly jump in because, and thanks, Steve, for picking us up. So first, I think it's very much correct that we are here in part because of Kharkiv, because the Russian military learned the lessons of Kharkiv and sought very much not to have that repeated. Second, the much closer offensive operation was Kherson, and Kherson was a cautionary tale of what an advance could look like against even a moderately well-prepared defense. And a lot of analysts, including myself and Rob Lee, were writing back in December that based on what we saw in Kherson, if Russian military had substantially dug in the south, it would make this a pretty challenging and costly offensive, and the force had to be prepared for that. And a lot of the Western expectations had to be based on that, not off of Kharkiv. And we wrote about that again back in the end of the winter and again back in the spring, right? So one of the ironies, I think, of what happened in this offensive is that most of the military analysts, I think, ended up being quite right, that this was going to be challenging, it was doable, but it was going to be costly, and not to have these expectations based on Kharkiv. And in terms of who set the expectations, yeah, I'll be a bit pointed. It's very interesting to see the commentators that actually set the expectations that this would be easy and Ukrainian forces could just cut through like a hot knife through butter, now all trying to find the people who set those expectations, I think a lot of that commentary back in the spring leading into it was probably a bit unhelpful. Last point. So going back to a May article on Foreign Affairs and sort of beyond the offensive, I thought that the real issue was how this offensive turned out, right? And this is going to your political question. Even if it was very spectacular and successful, look, it wasn't going to end the war. That's the reality. And so the challenge was that the West was consistently taking a wait-and-see approach. Okay, this is already a long war, actually, by any standard of interstate conventional wars, and it was clearly going to be a longer war. And what you see is consistently that folks don't appreciate the lead times for big decisions they have to make, right? And when they take a wait-and-see approach, they essentially condemn the war to another prolonged attritional period, and then they might actually then force another sort of surge effort. If you ask, how did we end up with a surge effort without enough collective training, without enough unit cohesion, without enough command staff training, and sort of building the runway as you're trying to take off from it in advance of this offensive? The answer is very simple. People waited until January to start making those commitments and to get on top of it rather than doing so sooner. And so a lot of my writing had been focused on, the assumption is going to be a long war, making big structural investments, and making those decisions, understanding the lead times behind them so as not to kind of repeat these mistakes, right? And also realizing that however the offensive went, good, bad, something in the middle, what have you, qualified success, it wasn't going to end the war. And you need to be making those decisions before the offensive was over, because the offensive honestly is likely going to go until October, if not November. And if you're waiting until those months to make these big decisions, then you are literally repeating the mistakes of the past year. That's just my view.
Alexandra?
Yes, just some quick comments. So I think I just want to circle back to what we were talking about at the very beginning about what's the it and as long as it takes. That's where I think that the administration needs to do a more comprehensive job of explaining to the American public what the stakes are of the war in Ukraine and where we want to go. I think that there are advantages to having that level of political flexibility, but on the other hand, I think we're starting to really see why the discussion is so focused on battlefield contingencies and on, as Stephen mentioned, on equipment. It's because we are not highlighting what the strategic goals are. I think that Americans intuitively understand why Ukraine is important. And I think with more shaping of that, that information environment and not just focusing on, a few months out or what Ukraine's battlefield victories look like, but really talk about the strategic aims of this war, I think that would go a long way to delinking perhaps the political war from the battlefield one.
Right. So I would like to start from what Alexandra just mentioned. I think it's a very important moment, and I've been trying to hammer it down in each presentation I have for American audiences that this administration is not doing enough in terms of mobilizing public support, in terms of explaining why this is important, because they've tried everything. I mean, if you try, okay, we're defending Ukraine as democracy versus a authoritarian regime, it's probably true, but it couldn't be the foundation really for a lot of Americans. It doesn't, like, what does it even mean? Who is democracy, who is not? A lot of Americans, unfortunately, are not necessarily even sold on the merits or benefits of democracy, so it doesn't work. International order, okay, but there's been some violations here and there, so we're doing this just because what Russia is doing is wrong in terms of international order. In terms of just pure moral outrage, I think was a driving force in many countries, including US, when people just saw what Russian troops are doing in Ukraine. But it tends, unfortunately, to subside, the moral outrage. People are getting used to it, so it's been a year and a half. So it's not enough. So you have to think in terms of interest, national interest, and there are plenty, I'm sure. But the White House is not doing that. And let me say that because I'm also an Americanist and I also analyze the U.S. not just foreign policy but domestic politics. It's known for this administration not to have very good PR or communication kind of job on various issues, including domestic issues, economic, social, and so on. But on foreign policy as well, they need to hammer down every day. Basically, President Biden himself and other people around him, they should stop talking about the things that I mentioned before, like values, international order, democracy, and so on, and basically focus on why is this important for the United States? On offensive, very briefly, I'm in agreement with everyone who spoke before me. I think that there were heightened expectations. Absolutely. People got to in position by the end of last year that Ukrainian military is some kind of a Superman with superpowers, like Avengers. They're going to just strike and do whatever it takes. And the Russians are doomed and so on. And that was a very primitive, simplified thinking. And Russians learned their mistakes indeed. And they can do that. I mean, there are certain problems with the way they think about how they fight that are still there. It's just in the nature of their political system. But other than this, they're learning. They're learning their mistakes and the lessons. So that's a problem. I'm sorry about the noise. Apparently, someone has a birthday here in a cafe that I'm sitting in. So I'll conclude by saying that everything matters. People matter. A lot of good fighters Ukraine had last year, we lost them. A lot of other people who came in their place are not as good enough or not trained enough or not motivated enough. Material also matters. It does. How many of those Leopards we actually have? Much less than we were promised. Many other things in the same thing, in the same category. Like the Patriot missiles, a big achievement, but how many of those do we have? So Kiev is more or less protected. South Ukraine, for instance, of Ukraine, Odessa, Danube coast is not because not enough been given, or sometimes they're not even a good protection against certain missiles that Russians are using. So material does matter, I think, but people matter more. And unfortunately, we're losing some of our best guys, So a lot of criticism was about the mobics, the people that Russia mobilizes. But in Ukraine, they also mobilize people without any experience, people who are not very healthy, and so on. So it's a problem. And of course, mobilization reserve in Russia, as we all know, it's like 3.5 times more population. And I think in authoritarian regime, there is more. It's easier sometimes to do mobilization than in a democratic country like Ukraine. And most finally, there are perils for democracy like Ukraine. Like, for instance, right now there's a debated question, should we have elections on time or should we just delay them because we have this massive war and martial law? So what do we do? I mean, what's the right way? If we don't do elections, people might say, okay, Ukraine is not democracy, so why should we continue to support it because it's democracy? Or if we do it, it's risky, even logistically, what happens if Russian missiles strike at the voting polls, stations and so on. So yeah, there are many unanswered questions and challenges before Ukraine and related to the war or politically and so on.
Before we go to there's some good questions in the Q&A now about some kind of more general topics, but I want to stay on the sort of specifics of the military conflict for just one more set of questions. We have a question from Julian Lowenfield in the chat here. We also have a question from regarding sorry, I lost track of where it was, regarding Russian air superiority. We have a question over in the YouTube chat about munitions. Here's the question I want to ask. Are we at this point? So one question is, we had the air superiority question. Another question is this question about munitions. But we've had this discussion here today about how we've now moved into this kind of more attrition phase of the war. Are we out of the period of time where the question is is each new weapons going to be provided? And we're into the period of time now where are there enough weapons at this point in time, given the fighting that is happening at this point in time? Or are we still in this world where the decisions have to be about, do we not have enough munitions on the ground for Ukraine? We aren't going to get success until we ramp up munitions productions, or we're not going to get success until the next weapon system is coming through here. Or have we moved out of the phase? Like, is the question now more about the tactics that are being employed with the munitions that are there, or maybe Alexander's point about the training that's being employed, or is it still a question of munitions? And then just to layer one other thing on top of this, I wonder how this all plays out against the backdrop of the US 2024 elections, and whether at this point in time, if we have gotten into, okay, the air superiority is not as big as a problem as it was thought before, the munitions are ramping up in the levels where they are, is it a question of Russia trying to run out the clock to the US 2024 election in case Trump is reelected? How does that tie into sort of where we are in this question of like thinking about the logistics of air superiority, enough weapons, enough munitions? Sorry if I bundled too much together there. I was trying to pull a couple of different questions together, and then we'll pull back a little bit.
All right, I'll go first again if none of my colleagues want to be the lead sled dog here. So starting on the munitions issue, material obviously matters, right? And more is always better than less, and better is always better than worse. That said, the public debate way overemphasizes the role of material here. And it way overemphasizes the role of specific weapons and specific weapon types. A lot of the overenthusiasm for this offensive is because it was going to have Western tanks and Western infantry fighting vehicles. Well, if you put a modern anti-tank missile into the flank of a Leopard 2, right, it's going to blow up just like a T-72 will. The Leopard 2 is a better tank in a lot of ways. It's worth what it costs, but it isn't a Wunderwaffen. It isn't this super weapon that somehow or another is going to change the complexion of the war. If you just look back over the history of the last century or more of warfare, outcomes correlate very poorly with the nature of the weapons in use, right? Outcomes correlate quite strongly with the nature of the military methods being employed, the tactics and the operational art. As a general rule, that's way more influential for when you get breakthroughs and big advances and when you get stalemates and slow advances than whether the T-34 has appeared on the battlefield as the greatest, latest Soviet tank design or not, whether the Tiger II has appeared on the battlefield as the latest, greatest German tank design. The debate focuses on this because it's easy to talk about. You can see these things. They are appealing to a sizable fraction of the public, but it's generally speaking a red herring, right? None of that's to suggest that we shouldn't give them Leopard 2s or Abrams tanks, right? Better is better than worse. More is better than less, absolutely. But the idea that this offensive isn't breaking through because we just didn't give them the right stuff at the right moment, I think gets the causal dynamics of modern theater warfare completely wrong. With respect to air superiority in particular, air superiority is great, right? I'd love to have it. Give it to me whenever it's available, right? But especially at the moment, the trends in air defense technology over the last generation have made orthodox understandings of air superiority less and less achievable. So this debate tends to focus on F-16s at the moment, right? The argument is often that we are asking the Ukrainians to do something that we Americans would never do without air superiority. If we just gave them F-16s, then there would be a breakthrough. Very hard to believe. And none of that's an argument that they should or shouldn't necessarily have F-16s. The argument that the F-16 is somehow going to punch a hole in deep, well-prepared Russian defenses if they're properly backed by reserves, I think is fantasy land. This is a non-stealthy airplane that the US Air Force is transitioning away from because it's not survivable in a heavily defended modern airspace. This is an extremely heavily defended airspace in Ukraine. Russia has deployed an enormous density of modern, pretty sophisticated air defenses. And the idea that F-16s are going to live long enough in that kind of environment to create a breakthrough, I think is highly improbable. None of that means that it wouldn't be better to have F-16s. Among other things, they're efficient platforms for shooting down drones cheaply, well to the rear area. The likelihood that close air support by F-16s is going to blow through the Surovikin line, I think, is unrealistic. And the F-16 is an extremely expensive form of assistance. If you've got a finite budget of how much money the Biden administration is allowed to provide, is the smart way to provide it to eat up massive amounts of it in a tiny number of F-16s because of their cost? Or is the right way to use it to provide much larger numbers of, in my view, rather more useful things like, you know, armored vehicles on the ground, or especially artillery ammunition, or especially expansions in the capacity of the defense industrial base to produce artillery ammunition. So I think this focus on the F-16 in particular, I think is just rather misguided.
Michael, you wanted to weigh in as well?
Yeah, maybe kind of letting Steve go first and do most of the damage in the breaching assault effort, and then I follow through with the second wave, second echelon. So I think that on the question regarding Russian adaptation and learning, the answer is definitely yes, they have. And I think that last year the conversation overly caricatured things without looking seriously at the long-term challenges the Ukrainian military would have in sustaining the fight, but also without a due acknowledgement of the steady change in adaptations in the Russian military. The Russian force still have big structural issues. I'll point to them very briefly. One is manpower and sufficient rotation of manpower to keep in the fight relative to the size of the front that they're trying to hold in Ukraine. Second is artillery ammunition. They spent way too much last year and have had to conserve and ration it, and have had to change their doctrine around how they employ artillery. Third is centralized command and control, just the way they command their forces, right? And they have pretty weak initiative due to the military culture in general. Initiative is not rewarded. And last, force quality and weakness of morale as such, it's very hard for the Russian military to restore any kind of significant offensive potential, but morale is not so weak that enables very easy breaks in the line, routes, desertions, what have you, either, right? So the Russian military really struggling to get any sort of offensive potential going, but still in a position to mount a relatively effective prepared defense. On game changer silver bullets, you know, I'm very much on the same page as Steve on this. You especially don't find them in a conventional war, where they often do come down to attrition. And unfortunately, kind of superficial media coverage and political debates that fixate on whether to send this weapon or now send this weapon, or should be the Taurus missile next, what have you, just kind of often miss the point, right? Weapons have their greatest impact, at least I find, when they are first introduced on the battlefield at scale. Then they drive a cycle of adaptation by your opponent. Then they eventually generate counters to themselves. And one of the problems you've had with the lesser impact of, let's say, Storm Shadow missiles in this offensive was the hard cycle of adaptation that the introduction of HIMARS last June imposed on the Russian military, right? That's just the reality. And what you need to appreciate is that you monetize the impact of that weapon system for the first 2 months that it was deployed, right? But it's hard to get it back. It's hard to have it again. It's still there. HIMARS is still very effective, but you know, you are going to drive adaptation to them. The main issues have been artillery ammunition, providing sufficient air defense, and training to help maintain Ukrainian force quality and reconstitute the force, right? Material, reconstituting the force, and munitions. They're not exciting. They don't drive great media coverage, but they are the big things you need in a prolonged conventional war, and they're permanent treadmills that you're running on. They're never problems that you've solved. You have to keep managing them and keep thinking about the future. And last point here, to what Steve said. So look, air superiority isn't something that you magically get when you buy F-16s and you train pilots to use them, right? Air superiority is something you attain, and you also have to maintain as well, because opponents regenerate air defense and contest the airspace. It's not just about the aircraft and good pilots. And here's the truth. There's a lot of military has to change about itself to attain air superiority against an air defense and another air force. And the Russian Air Force themselves discovered this very early on in Ukraine, in the beginning of this war, when they realized that they didn't have the training, the equipment, or the preparation to effectively deal with Ukrainian air defense, a lot of which was probably the largest park of ground-based radar guided air defense that existed in Europe was in Ukraine. And it was rather effectively used. Ukraine's military, as it is organized around decisive use of land-based fires, not strategic employment of air power, right? That's a fair assessment. So I think that it's very important that Ukraine begins a transition to using F-16. I think that they view Armed Forces of Ukraine very much up to the challenge. But look, coordinating air power and ground power is actually a lot harder than just integrating and coordinating the 3 core land combat arms, right? The analogy I use is, if you think of infantry, armor, artillery, trying to coordinate those together is like juggling 3 balls, right, in the air. Having air and land power coordinated, integrate together, this is like more like 5, 6 balls being juggled at the same time, okay? And it's important to keep in mind. So what I'm basically saying is that it's great that Ukraine's making this transition. It's going to be a long-term transition. It's going to take time, but folks shouldn't, engage in magical thinking and assigning too much, as Steve said, to the F-16, understanding that it will bring important effects to the battlefield, but not to overly project or have those assumptions that they made about Leopard 2s and then basically shift them over to the F-16. As we've learned, there's a lot more to just to operating effectively as a force than just getting those capabilities. It just takes time. And some things you cannot shortcut. That's the reality.
Yeah, thanks so much. So we've covered a lot of ground of what's also in the Q&A. I think we want to hit a related topic that's also emerged over the summer as the counteroffensive has been going on, which is the sort of the varied and creative way in which Ukrainian forces have been striking targets in Russia itself. And maybe ask Alexandra and Volodya to weigh in on this from their respective perspectives, as well as sort of fill in anything from the previous question. But what is the sort of, the political dimension that this brings in? And from your perspective, has this changed the dynamic also of expectations in some way about the state of affairs in the campaign? Sorry, Volodya, do you want to tackle this?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure, I think it's a good question. I mean, there's a debate within Ukraine as well, like, why are we doing it? What does it give us or not? I think there are several things. First of all, I mean, it's a general idea of like some fairness and delivering some justice, because what they're doing to us, like we should be doing this to them. If this particular argument doesn't have any strategic meaning really, so more of a just generating morale, and that we can do this, we're able of this, we're boosting this morale of the people, that we're bringing fight back to them, and why should they actually be safe and sound when our cities are being destroyed? So there's this. Another thing is, I think Ukraine is trying to get more and more potential realized in asymmetric warfare. Certain things we can do on par with Russia, but some things we can if we go smart with drones, naval drones, aerial drones, with some missiles. We did some renovation to Neptune missile, so they were able to strike a S-400 target, if I'm not mistaken, in Crimea. So, I mean, if you're just flying something in the area over a city, Moscow, that's one thing. But even they're disrupting the work of Russian Moscow airports, there's already something, to Ukraine. And of course, ultimately, we are hoping that we will be able to change somehow their attitude by Russians, with Russians about the war, if you bring the war to their door threshold, right? So there is no evidence that's been happening, but maybe eventually, if we increase the number of strikes, that would actually help. So I think there's a number of arguments to be made in why Ukraine is doing what it's doing. And if we manage to increase intensity and type of weapons we use in those strikes, and including striking like strategic bombers, for instance, on Russian bases 100 miles away, like the Pskov strike, for instance, was very, very, very demonstrative, I would say. I think that's going to be working to the benefit of Ukraine, even though, I mean, it's not going to produce any fast radical changes.
Great, thank you. Alexandra?
Yes, this was a fantastic overview, and I agree with all those points, so I won't add too much to it. Just to highlight that I think that part of the motivation of why this is really important for Ukraine is that Russia basically benefits from having a set of territory that cannot be hit essentially with Western weapons, to which it can retreat and move all of its logistics through that. And I think that's part of it was trying to think about what would be another way to expand the set of places where Russia could be attacked and make them struggle with things like sufficiently supplying and communicating with their forces. But yet I agree, we don't really see extensive enough of a use of these kinds of attacks to really create pressure in those places. It more seems to be motivated at morale, I think, on increasing the Ukrainian morale and decreasing Russian morale. But we know, I think, from research and what we've seen in the conflict already, that those variables can be very hard to move with these kinds of air attacks. I just want to talk a little bit about the Western piece here. So Ukraine is not hitting those targets inside Russia with Western equipment. And that's been some of the implicit limitations on the Western aid that was being provided. I think as long as these attacks stay fairly limited, I don't see that though is undermining Western consensus around providing certain kinds of weapons to Ukraine though.
Yeah. Michael, would you like to weigh in on this particular issue? Also from the Russian perspective now? Okay. Final area here, and this comes up in the Q&A, is this sort of distinction between aiding Ukrainian victory and then the comments about weakening Russia, right? And the two are different rationales. Sometimes they're blended in one or in a list of justifications for why we're supporting Ukraine, certainly in the US and the EU. But perhaps, Volodya, you can unpack this, and anyone else there. Is this difference starting to be significant now in terms of the kinds of sort of narratives that are crystallizing and the kinds of domestic politics, both within Ukraine and within Ukraine supporters, that are being created and solidified as a result? What are the stakes in sort of saying outright that we want to weaken Russia, but we don't want a Ukrainian victory?
Well, I think that to support Ukraine and provide for some sort of Ukrainian victory, you need to weaken Russia. They are two, connected. Last year in the spring, earlier in this big war, Secretary Austin said as much, that our aim is to weaken Russia. And then, of course, normally Russian propaganda machine would stop here, but he continued. He said, to the extent that it stops being a threat to Ukraine and others in the region. And I think that's good enough. I mean, of course, he was criticized, and that comment was walked back by the White House back then. And there have been actually some hesitations with a strategy by the White House, frankly, flip-flopping, like sometimes euphoria, sometimes almost like panic. It's a long war. They should have understood it earlier than they did, apparently, that sometimes Ukrainian military were going to succeed, sometimes they're not, or it would take more time, so you cannot just subordinate your policy, your strategy, your tactic, your assistance to Ukraine to the fact of whether the Ukrainians are now on offensive or on defensive, succeeding or not succeeding at this particular point of time. So I think that Russia should still be, defeated to a certain extent, weakened, that it cease to be a problem for Ukraine, a big problem for Ukraine. And here we get into the territory which is heavily discussed by expert community in both Ukraine and US and Washington as well, and think tanks and so on, like what are going to happen after this war? Like what can we do for Ukraine? So how can we learn the lessons of February 24th, 22, so how can we go from supporting Ukraine right now to supporting Ukraine later and to prevent, Russia from, hitting Ukraine hard and maybe decrease this asymmetry between Russia and Ukraine with time, and next time Russians will think twice or more times before hitting Ukraine, because they would know there would actually be a very serious escalation. So I think there is this debate to be had. But right now, of course, obviously, for us Ukrainians, the eyes are on offensive, and we're still hoping. I mean, not overly optimistic already, of course, but hoping that it would succeed one day. Yeah.
If I could just add to that, I think when we talk about victory for Ukraine, one area that's really important is the political element of this, and specifically what that means for me, and a place where we see US leadership is Ukraine in NATO. Without that, we don't have a settlement that essentially will ensure Ukraine's territorial integrity of the part that's not occupied by whatever that looks like. Could be different, but the existence and survival of Ukraine as a state, and also regional order within Europe. And so what that means is that we need to now be planning directly for that process. There is a lot of reform work that needs to be done to make sure that Ukraine will be a fully participating and democratic member of NATO. And without having, I think, U.S. leadership on this, this angle, which means specifically putting the level of consistent engagement and resources on the ground to work on that particular reform piece and NATO integration piece, I think it will be hard to get to that sort of outcome. So that's what we need to see more of. And that itself would be a major political victory for Ukraine and I think for all of us.
Michael?
Yeah, I'll just briefly say, I think Volodymyr Alexander raised important points, but the big thing to talk about in this offensive is going into the offensive was very clear that the countries that invested in it, that there were two broad categories of perceptions that they had in goals, right? There's some group of countries that truly genuinely believed in a military victory for Ukraine. But there's another set of countries that invested in it just hoping that the offensive would put Ukraine in a better position to conduct negotiations, okay, after the offensive, from a position of strength, let's say. And I was very critical of this group, writing in May saying that it made no sense. If the offensive was very successful, why should Ukraine negotiate to give away or trade away any of its other territory? What would the negotiations genuinely be about if Ukraine is succeeding in winning on the battlefield? And if the offensive wasn't particularly successful, then it's very difficult to see Russians being interested in negotiating. And actually, even when there was a highly successful offensive last year in Kharkiv, you didn't really see Russians negotiate at all, right? You only saw them double down and commit and actually try to formally annex the four territories that they hadn't fully occupied, but at least had partial control over. Okay. Point being is, after this offensive, I think that we are generally going to find out who is who amongst Ukraine's allies and friends, because we're entering a phase in the war where countries and their leaderships have to evaluate their strategy and their commitment without the illusion that there's a shortcut or a way out of the prolonged war, right? And whether they were somehow hopeful that this one offensive would do it and lead to negotiations, or whether they genuinely believed in Ukrainian military victory, they're now going to have to reconcile with the facts either way. And my view is they should have done so before the offensive, right? That the mentality ahead of the offensive should never have been that this is going to lead to negotiations, but it's still very hard to kind of break the sentiment, right? There's definitely a group of countries that hold on to this expectation. And so to me, that's going to be the most important thing that's going to start coming out of this in the fall and heading into the winter.
All right, Stephen, we're down to, it's 1:29. So if you could, no, you make a copy. I'm going to give you the last word, but just asking you to keep it concise.
Very short last word is that there isn't going to be a military victory because Ukraine isn't conceivably able to destroy Russia's ability to make war. The war cannot end unless the Russians agree to stop shooting, because they will inevitably retain the ability to shoot if they so choose. Conventionally, that's called a negotiation. This could be a very one-sided negotiation, we hope, right? Ukraine retains most of what it's after. But Ukraine does not have the ability to win in a narrowly military sense of destroying the opponent's capacity to resist. That ain't going to happen here. The conditions are not ripe for negotiation now for all the reasons you suspected. The war has to proceed to the point where it makes the conditions ripe for negotiation, and preferably a negotiation that's heavily favorable to Ukraine. But the idea that a breakthrough could create a military victory and end the war, I think, is misbegotten. That's inconceivable. It would be weird and irrational for Putin to say, okay, I guess I'll stop shooting just after I've lost everything that I thought I had gained at massive cost to Russia by invading in February of 2022. Sooner or later, there's going to have to be a settlement. It's probably not going to be soon, but military means are a means that they can't produce the end in themselves.
All right, I'm going to take the last word then on top of that, just to throw one other thing into that conversation, which is I think there's another outcome here where we don't get a negotiated settlement, but the fighting largely stops. And that is this frozen conflict model that we see throughout the region, right? And so I think there is something between that negotiated settlement and people keep shooting. It's that people keep shooting sporadically, but there's not much going on. And I think that's one of the things we'll have to think about as well, is whether that is something Poland is going for.
Whether that's an end to the war. But anyway.
Right. But whether it's not really. Unfortunately, we now have like 20 years of examples of these kinds of situations emerging in particularly in this area.
And we had 8 years in Ukraine of that prior to 22. Yeah.
Right. So we could come back to something like that. All right. Obviously, this panel could go on for another hour and a half. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Those of you who joined us, the panelists who've joined us previously, thank you so much. Those who haven't, we hope to have you back on again. This has been enormously illuminating for me, if albeit, depressing at times. We're still talking about these kinds of things, but I want to thank you for sharing your expertise. I want to thank everyone who joined us, both on YouTube and those of you who joined us on the webinar here. Our next New York City Russia Public Policy Seminar will be on October 11th. We're still working on finalizing what the topic is going to be for that case. We did get a couple of questions about whether or not these events are on the record. They are on the record, although we do urge, given the sort of pace of the conversation here, we want to urge people, if you want to quote from the conversation today, we would urge you to go look at the YouTube video, which you can reach from the Harriman Institute's at Columbia's YouTube channel to make sure that you get the quotes correct. But yes, these are always on the record events. And with that note, I want to once again thank Alex, thank the Harriman Institute, thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their continued funding support, and really join me in thanking our panelists for sharing their expertise and insights with us today. So thanks all, everybody.
Thanks very much, everyone.